Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation, the book talk. And today, this one is being hosted by AAAS. Sorry for all the wait. There was just a lot of miscommunication. This book talk is going to be on Dr. Crystal Anderson on her wonderful book, on K-pop, and I'm actually very excited about this. And presenting with her, well, to have the conversation with her is Dr. Jessie Guestford. And a little bit about Dr. Jessie Guestford is that he received a BS in music education from Westchester University, and MM in music composition from Crane School of Music at SUNY Potsdam. I'm not sure I said that right. And DMA in music composition from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Guestford has studied composition with Andrew Simpson, Jack Browning, Sever Tipe, Warren Bird, Vinco Globalcar, and Lucas Foss. His music has been heard throughout North America, including performances during the CMS Nation Conference. In Europe at the Etching Conference in Ovilar, France, and in Africa on South African radio. Dr. Guestford has received numerous awards, including the Subito Grant for Emerging Composers, awarded by the American Composers Forum. As an associate professor in the School of Music at George Mason University, Dr. Guestford has focused on the scholarship of teaching with and about technology and the music of John Cage. Dr. Guestford is also co-founding director of MMT Music, Motion, Technology, a dance and music collective based in Northern Virginia, creating new evening length works involving dancers, musicians, and interactive audio and visual technologists. So welcome, Dr. Jessie Guestford. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And the guest of honor is Dr. Crystal S. Anderson. And a little bit about her is that she works within the field of transnational American studies, Black internationalism, and global Asias, focusing on cultural studies, including popular culture, media studies, visual culture, audience reception, and literature. Her 2020 book, Soul to Soul, African-American Music and K-pop, explores the impact of African-American popular music on contemporary Korean pop, R&B, and hip-hop, and the role of global fans as the music press. And this is the book that we will be discussing today. Her 2013 book, Beyond the Chinese Connections, Contemporary Afro-Asian Cultural Production, uses the films of Bruce Lee to interpret cross-cultural dynamics in post-1990 novels, films, and anime. She has published articles on Afro-Asian cultural studies in several journals, including African American Reviews, Milas, Ethnic Studies Reviews, and Extrapolation, as well as book chapters on masculinity in K-pop and Afro-Japanese representation in art. She also manages several digital humanities projects, including KPK, K-pop Collective, the oldest and only public scholarship site on K-pop for academics and fans. A veteran blogger on Asian popular culture, she is also a former associate and chief editor for Hello K-pop. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Crystal Anderson. I am very excited. I do want to let everybody know that this meeting, this video is recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. And so without further ado, let's get started with the talk.
Hi, Crystal.
Hey, Jessie.
How are you?
I feel like we do this all the time. So.
We do, but it often goes back to K-pop, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So I had some questions when reading your book, if you don't mind me starting. And one was around just the label itself, K-pop. And in your book, I actually, when I was reading it, copied the quote. I will say I like reading digitally because you can copy very easily. So in order to capture the diverse array of artists under the K-pop umbrella, I define K-pop as a kind of contemporary Korean popular music that first emerged in the 90s as global aspirations and features a hybridity that combines Korean and foreign musical elements. I was curious as I was reading that and looking at the array of people you were talking about in the book. Is that too broad as a musical genre, right? Does it allow artists to have freedom, because it covers everything from, as you term, the idols, right, side, which is the extremely pop side of it, right, to artists doing more individual, and even when you got on the hip hop side, more social political even commentary in it. I'm just, what are your thoughts? Is this because we're just talking about an area in Korea, right, or is there musical and social combinations in there as well?
That's a really great question, Jesse. So I think the significant part of this, and one of the reasons why I framed K-pop in the way that I did, was in response to the way K-pop was being talked about in the press, in the media. And so I think you can trace this probably back to Psy. When Psy kind of, broke through in the United States, suddenly everything that, every kind of music that Koreans had ever done was suddenly K-pop. And that was really not the case. You definitely have a really strong, as you have in other countries, a really strong tradition of Korean popular music. But there was something very different about the music that eventually produced, or the tradition that eventually produced Psy. And there was a really significant break. And it was really interesting to read the scholarship by Korean scholars about what that break meant in Korea. It's like the Beatles in the West. So you had like K-pop and then the stuff that comes after, because it was such a seismic shift. It was generational. It was definitely something that the youth gravitated towards. It was not like their parents' music. And a lot of that revolves around not only the cultural shift, but also the social and economic shift that happened in Korea at the same time, that allowed far more foreign influences to come through in media, the development of digital music, the simultaneous kind of shift towards culture industries by these agencies, kind of all coalesced around this thing that we call K-pop. But at the same time, people were calling K-pop a genre, and it's not, because they were defining K-pop solely by the idols. And, I like idol as much as the next person, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that global fans were calling K-pop that wasn't prior Korean popular music, but was something else. It was something that they could access, whether it was on YouTube or, through other kinds of means like LimeWire. It was something that resonated with them. But again, it was really kind of different from a lot of the music, the Korean popular music that was being made, say in the 1980s. It's only, you only get this kind of music in the 1990s and after.
So there is this very specific time element to it too, right? Like that's really fascinating, because genre shift and change, of course, in music, right? But that's kind of the breaking point, or the point of explosion, where lots of things changed for Korean music.
Yes.
Which of course it meets up with some of the social political changes going on in Korea around, right? That happened not too far before that, right?
Exactly. So it's the ramifications of the democracy movements, the IMF failure, those types of things that happen in Korea to kind of create this perfect storm that creates K-pop.
do you feel, so still thinking about this idea of this grouping of artists, right? Do you feel that allows, especially let's say other artists who aren't idols, right, who don't have the machine around them, which I have some questions about that as well, being lumped in together? I mean, there seems like there's much more of a wide range of music happening in Korea that still falls under this, let's say, post 1990s blossoming or change, right? Do you think that's because we all view that? I mean, why do you think we all view this in the West, especially, as just one edifice of artists?
I think because it's largely Korean performers, right? That's how we, do the shorthand.
Mhm.
In the West, it's really important to note that not all Korean artists enjoy being lumped in under the K-pop umbrella. I'm surprised I haven't gotten any notes on that, but they will come out and say there's a rock band, Jarim, that absolutely declares that it is not K-pop. But the other parts of my K-pop definition, I think, come into play. And one of those parts is that recognition by Western or global fans, because once again, not every Korean artist is viewed by a global fan because they can't get access to it. There are whole genres of Korean popular music, except for, there's some people who just really like trot. There are global people who like trot, but trot is a genre, is really something that's directed towards the Korean people. Koreans love trot. There's like a Mr. Trot competition. Like that is a genre that is, largely targeted and follows conventions that are recognized by Koreans, less so by people in other places. So even though it seems like I'm like claiming everything after 1990, I really am not, because, there are a lot of, particularly a lot of vocalists that I would not consider to be K-pop, but they're really popular in Korea, who have careers in the 1990s. It really, this kind of, there's a group of people that had, for instance, presence on YouTube. So they're like, there's some Korean artists that you could not find. Even now, you gotta do some tricky stuff to be able to find their music, because they're not globally directed. They don't have that global aspiration. And as much flack as the idols get, for a lot of people, the idols were the gateway or the entrance into other Korean pop, Korean genres. So some people, the only way they get to a hip hop group like Epic High is that they go through an idol group that has rappers in it. And so in a lot of ways, there's not as much of a gulf or a gap between the idols and these other genres. And then Korea is small. South Korea is small. So a lot of people know a lot of other people because that music industry is really not as ginormous as, say, the United States. So it's hard to say, oh, who are you? Because next thing you know, I'm featuring you on my album because you just happen to be there. Your agency is like, 2 streets over, there's a merger that, it's really, I think that in the West, we were so adamant on cordoning off K-pop from other serious, music that has, political or social weight to it, that we fail to also recognize the cultural value that K-pop under the big umbrella has.
Very good. Thank you. That's awesome. There's a question in the Q&A that I think gets to some of what I wanted to talk about, this idea of, like, in music, we often talk about borrowing, quotation, and appropriation, right? As being like different levels of what you should or shouldn't do, right? And also, I think in your book, you touch a little bit about, especially with the female idol groups, the idea of exoticism of the female Korean, right? And as I was reading it, I was really struck with the idea was was that exoticism coming both ways, right? Was the African American community being the exotic for the Korean artists when it first started, right? I'm curious, and it gets on this question also about, you know, controversy around racism and appropriation with those artists as well.
So let's put some historical context around this about how far African American culture and how foreign African American culture would be to South Koreans, given the presence, the US military presence in South Korea during a time where you had sizable representation or participation in the military of African Americans. Linked to that also, that in the 1950s, was it 1950? I think it was in the 1950s. Okay, maybe it was in the 1960s, when Billboard suspended its R&B chart because everything that would have been on the R&B chart, except they called it something else back then, was actually on the Hot 100 or the popular chart because it was all Black music. It was Motown.
It was still called the race chart, I think, then even.
Was it? I
Yeah,
know it was.
still
It
called
didn't
race
turn
chart.
into R&B until later.
Right.
But because African American music had moved so decidedly into the mainstream that for like that minute, American culture, and we can make the same argument today, that African American culture is the leading edge and the representation of American culture for foreign countries. So given those two things, we'd have to, you know, really think about how foreign African American culture or African American music culture is to Korea. Now, we're not talking about the complexities and the historical developments of African American culture, right? Because that, like it does for those of us in the United States, requires us to take, you know, an intentional dive into what that is. But the music has a really long history in Korea, and then it's also complicated by the relationship between how the Koreans see that music, but it's almost always attached to American culture, which has a particular kind of resonance if you're a South Korean. So that's the kind of context we're working with. We have certainly had instances of things like blackface, but I always like to think of this as a continuum. And fans, some fans tend not to. Some fans are really, you know, kind of it's very cut and dry. It's appropriation, and their tolerance for things beyond appropriation is very short. So I remember reading a comment under a story where a Korean producer said, yeah, you know, the kids meaning idols, the kids, you know, they like Black music, so, you know, we try to incorporate elements of Black music in the music. And the comments said, that's racist. And I think this was the last time I actually participated in a comment section, because I couldn't understand how that was racist, since we refer to Black music as Black music. Why is it when they refer to music as Black music, it's somehow racist? Well, they don't mean it that way. I'm like, well, how do they mean it? So the other complicating factor in trying to ascertain or describe or delineate appropriation on this continuum is how much do we know about Black culture itself, that it's also happening. So at what point, or how are we going to describe this thing as Black, as in racially Black, or Black, as Robin Kelly suggests, culturally Black, which is, you know, more often, and he's not the only one to suggest that Black culture, you know, one of the hallmarks of Black culture is its is this embrace of people who are not Black to enjoy what it is. At the same time, it often strikes me as interesting as there's a straight line from, you know, someone describing something that happens in K-pop as cultural appropriation, and no mention of the how Black culture, Black things like blackface were introduced to East Asia. Black people did not bring blackface to East Asia. White people brought white blackface to East Asia. And so there's yet another layer on top of this that connects race with nationality, particularly in terms of blackface in the United States. There are some things that we know are, to me, at one end of this spectrum is racial mockery and demeaning. So a racial performance that mocks or demeans. Clearly culturally appropriative because it has a purpose, right, to do harm. Some things that we see approach that, and some things we see don't approach that. So for me, I like to have a little bit more complication around that, and citation to me is a little bit better at getting at not just you took this from my culture, but what did you cite and how did you cite it? The other thing that comes into play is the history of white Americans taking elements of Black culture, in some instances, taking away all the things that make it great, and then presenting this watered down version for a mainstream audience. And that's what happened in the 1950s to some artists, but I don't think that's what's happening with K-pop. Koreans do not substitute for white Americans in this particular equation.
Yeah, in your book, you often talk about, you know, the Black and white duality in America versus what, you know, Koreans are perceiving this as, right? And so is that what you're kind of getting at there, is that, you know, Korea doesn't see it, it sees it as almost more as American culture, or does it actually see it racially?
I think that's the crux, right? Mm-hmm. Because for them, America has been the entity that they've been dealing with and interacting with, right? So they are not, you know, they may not be as familiar with things like the civil rights movement or labor movement or women's movement in the United States in terms of social movements, but they know whose flag came rolling through South Korea and split the peninsula in half. And they've seen the United States and its imperialist moves in other places in East Asia. And so I think sometimes we forget that when Black culture, especially from the United States, moves out into a global space, it's not just racial, but it's also often attached to a particular kind of American culture that foreign cultures, ethnic cultures have experienced. And so it's just complicated.
Isn't it always? That's actually what I love about the history of music, though, right? Is that complication and the fact that that borrowing of, you know, styles and what we like, especially in this country, right, is is that melting pot we always dream of. Like, music is that, right? I mean, there's always, of course, people that do the wrong thing, right? But in general, the people creating the music love something and they want to incorporate that in their own, right? And it's not about trying to be negative towards what you're borrowing. That's why you're borrowing, is because you love it, not because you are trying to say, you know, anything negative about that culture or that person or that bit of music that you're borrowing from, right? So the other thing that was interesting, I was thinking historically about music in the US, and you picked the word soul specifically, S-O-U-L, for your book, right? Immediately was interested in the parallels between Motown specifically and the idols in Korea. Can you speak to that at all, or your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I was a K-pop fan before I started researching K-pop. So I have that K-pop fan insider knowledge. And one of the things that you gain as a K-pop fan, one of the things that a lot of K-pop fans practice is probably spending an inordinate amount of time watching behind the scenes footage. And so you're watching all of this. So it's not, the glitzy, made up, really, highly stylized choreography. This is people rolling out of the bed at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to the practice studio to practice the choreography or to practice the songs or whatever, traveling from the airport to the hotel, like all of this extraneous kinds of things. But looking at that extraneous kinds of things and knowing what we know about the intentional casting and training program that adults undergo, for us in the United States, the clear parallel is Motown. And I saw, quite a few journalists make that parallel, but I didn't see them go quite as far as I thought they should have, because it's not just, the bands are put together and, Berry Gordy had a hand and he was very hands-on and, putting these acts together. The scholarship had often said that the development of K-pop and artist development in K-pop had more in common with the way that J-pop idols are created. And I'm like, yeah, but unlike Japan, who literally does not care whether you get this music or not, Korea was very, why are they doing all of this stuff? They're not doing all of this stuff for the idols to sit in Korea. They're doing all of this stuff because K-pop is globally directed. And that was the thing that really struck me. The artist development is very similar to Motown, but then you have to ask the question, why was artist development so important at Motown? What was Berry Gordy trying to do in addition to making money? He was trying to rehabilitate the image of African Americans in the mainstream perception. And that's exactly what K-pop is doing also. And they're following the same playbook. So that's why Motown makes more sense to me than the J-pop model for idols. And you see that, if you, once again, tons of behind the scenes footage, the amount of time that they spend training and rehearsing and learning languages, and like, Beyonce doesn't need to learn a language. She's just going to roll up in Spain and do her thing. And so all of that to me is very much connected toward that project, that cultural project that the idols particularly are involved in, which is to promote a really great positive image of Korea. But the Korean agencies knew the same thing that Berry Gordy knew. You just can't put these people out here and only have them look good. There better be some talent behind that. And you have to make sure that music is as good as it can be. And that's the other thing that happens with K-pop music production. So we all know that they, as modern music production is very collaborative. You're using a beat from here, you're getting this thing from there, so K-pop is very known for using foreign music producers. But at the end of the day, that music always goes back to Korea, and then they do the special thing to it, and then they release it, which is why, to me, and to a lot of fans, K-pop doesn't sound like anybody other countries' popular music, even though it draws on genres that we are all familiar with. There's a particular kind of thing that Korean music producers do. Michael Furr says that it is something that is unique and distinct to Korean music producers. I recently had somebody ask me what that was. I'm like, I'm not Korean. You got to ask the Koreans what that is. But Michael Furr argues that Koreans can hear it even if global fans can't.
So it's like asking, what was so special about that one building in Detroit, right? Like, and why the music came. What led me to, I thought, see that deeper was that language thing, because the Motown performers had to go through basically a finishing school as well, right? And learn to speak so that it was more palatable for white audiences. I mean, let's be honest, that at the core, that's what it was, right? Dress, walk. I mean, they went through all of those besides hitting the recording studio and doing what they needed to do there, right? So that's why when I was reading, I was like, oh yeah, this is Motown. I mean, this is exactly what Berry Gordy did, down to the complete cultural shift, right? And making sure that there's a unified look and a unified way these artists are coming. Do you see where Motown did definitively up until, let's say, the later 60s, right, had a look to their artists, right, and a way? Did that start in similar for the different companies? Because I know there's a few competing companies in Korea. Was that similar, or did they diversify more quickly?
So I think that you can say from the very beginning, the big three, and some call it the big four. Maybe we're not even calling it the big anything anymore. But the agencies would put out groups that had a distinct personality, so that you knew this group came from SM Entertainment. Like even now, you know, a SM Entertainment group when you see one, is very different from a JYP act or a YG Entertainment act. Happy, formerly known as Big Hit, home of BTS, is a little different because they've structured differently. Big Hit's primary group was BTS, and then to a later extent, they debuted TXT. But something that Happy / Big Hit has done that the other agencies haven't is that they've taken on, well, the other agencies have taken on subsidiaries, but not in a way that Happy has, because as far as I know, no Korean agency has scooped up an American company like Happy did for Scooter Braun's company. And that's significant, it's huge. And so this is what they would do. Instead of kind of growing their own idols, they would just embrace a subsidiary that already had idols there.
So it's like a tech startup, like when a tech company, like some other smaller tech companies already creating something that you like, you just grab the whole company. Is that kind of what they were doing?
Yeah, and the relationship, again, this is one of these gray areas in K-pop, because we don't really talk about it a whole lot. The idea is that the subsidiary still kind of does what it does, and it just gets money from Happy, and it doesn't have any, creative oversight from Happy, but we don't know exactly what their relationship is. And it's harder to kind of ascribe a agency ethos in the way that you could with the original big three.
Okay. Lanicha asked a question. Is there a group or a documentary source where you can get started if you don't know much about K-pop? If you haven't been a lifelong fan like you, Crystal, where can you go?
God, where would you start? Oh, that's a really great question. Because I can tell you the different trajectories that fans have used to get into K-pop. And it's very interesting because the qualitative work that I did suggested that one of the big factors for becoming a K-pop fan was being a fan of some other foreign popular culture. So whether that was anime, Bollywood, Hong Kong film, you were already over the 1-inch subtitle barrier. So getting into K-pop was really easy. So if you were an anime fan, you're halfway into K-pop already, because K-pop artists will do either the opening or closing track of an anime series. The other avenue was K-drama, and still is for a lot of people. So K-dramas, Korean television series, also genres. And Korean K-pop artists will do the soundtracks. They're called OSTs, original soundtracks. They will do the soundtracks of them. And if you happen upon an idol K-drama or one of the original gateway K-dramas like Boys Over Flowers or My Lovely Samsoon, you're going to get treated to a whole lot more and a whole lot of different, I would say different, even in Boys Over Flowers, different kinds of versions of K-pop. But if somehow you're not going through any of those avenues, I always say that there's a K-pop group for everybody. So whatever your current musical preferences, there's probably an analog somewhere in K-pop. I don't know if there's definitely not a documentary, because even though they're all K-pop, and even though all of the agencies are Korean agencies, like I said, they have like different kind of personalities to the acts that they produce. And so if I were to direct you to a documentary, it would almost always be something on a particular artist or an agency, in terms of like a group or what they call family concerts. So SM Entertainment has SM Town, YG has YG Nation. I forget what JYP is. And so you get a variety of people on that label. But it's hard. Everybody does have their gateway, and what you need is somebody who knows you, and they can, give you some recommendations on what you like based on what you currently like. But that peer-to-peer recommendation is huge for getting people into K-pop. So often we heard this story and the data about, yeah, I was at my friend's house and she showed me this group and it was the Wonder Girls. And or my second favorite and equally high, luck. Being on YouTube, hey, watch this video. And that video is, based on whatever the algorithm says it is that day.
Yeah, I think, well, once again, it goes to that subculture idea, right? Like if you're already into some other subculture, then you end up in this, right? You, especially one that maybe is already following around the circle of K-pop, right? So it makes sense that somebody would say, hey, listen to this or listen to this, right? It's how all subcultures, especially in music, that's how you get into anything, right? Is somebody drops you in there. So once again, I was thinking historically and other historical movements, like in music, especially in popular music, and thinking about house music in America and its export to the UK. Right? And how, house music started as a Black gay club genre, right? And it was only in Chicago Black gay clubs. I mean, it was like super specific. But somehow, it finds its way to Ibiza, where all the UK tourists end up over the summer, and then just like flocks to the mainland of UK and blows up, and to the point where house music was even like, people didn't realize sometimes that this was actually a Black style from Chicago. Do you see, I mean, you said a little bit about, do you see some of that? And partly what they did, of course, is import all the Americans to help make that. Did that also happen with K-pop, right? Was there a lot of American import to say, quote this style or borrow from the style?
It's very interesting because K-pop, to its credit, went to the source. They didn't, go by the go through this kind of, house model. Yeah. They went to the source, and they were, and this is a point of contention with fans, and this is, why in the book I argue, that your listener competence, right, is really tied to how much you know, which then gives you a certain amount of ability to perceive certain things. So if you go all the way, like early K-pop, I mean, Lee Soo-man said it, he didn't sugarcoat. It's like, yeah, we base K-pop on Black music. Like, I don't know how, more direct you can get. But to their credit, they worked with Black producers and Black creatives. And once again, one of the things that I saw in, Rolling Stone, Billboard, Time magazine's, coverage of K-pop is that it does the same thing that we do with American music. We kind of obscure these origins and just kind of, plop them further down in the timeline. And not only that, you had some K-pop producers like Park Jin-young, who was in the United States writing for R&B artists. And so I think that one of the things that K-pop realized really early is that, you could base this on like what you heard somebody else do, that, but they were like, no, we're going to go to the source and we're going to, get that authentic stuff. But this is the thing that we also know about music, that process, thanks to technological, advances like the internet and digital music, made it easier so that they did not have to physically come to the United States to do that. But you can tell, particularly when you go into the discographies and you get into these deep cuts and you're like, you listen to a whole lot of, it wasn't just the Black music that was popular at the time. And I think that's the mistake that people make. Yes, early, 1990s K-pop is like New Jack Swing all the way. But that's not the only thing that's happening. And so going through the discographies, you learn, it's like, why do we have this gospel choir here? Like, why are we, got this jazz swing going on? They were really, I think, true students of African-American music.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about like the fact that at the same time, the 90s were that place where we could argue, right, New Jack Swing being a big part of it, right, where Black music in America took over as music again, right? Like similar to what we saw in Motown, and then there's this dip, and then this happened again. And it seemed to be interesting to me that corresponded almost exactly like just a few years later, K-pop comes out with a very like following this wave of what was really popular and what was perceived as American, right?
Yeah, but then if you remember, because I only know this because I did a talk on it. So 1992 is a really pivotal year because on one hand, it's the debut of Sotajian Boys, which are considered to be the godfathers. That's the beginning of K-pop, but it's also the year of the LA riots. So these two things happen at the same time, right? And so I thought, well, let me go look and just for fun, let me go see what was on the chart, what was popular in the year 1992. And we remember the 90s for like all that groovy New Jack Swing stuff. But there was there was like a ridiculous array of Black music coming out.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, that's what they started with. And so that's why you continue to get, strains of disco. I really think that some K-pop group tried to go country at one point, and continuing, right? So if the whole goal was, we'll just, do what's trendy and what's popular now, and we'll just move with the trends musically, that would make sense. But that's not what K-pop does. It continues to go back to these older genres and do different things with them.
We just got the 5-minute warning because if you let Crystal and we will talk about this all day.
We will.
I didn't know if there were any more questions from the group for Crystal. Because Crystal and we'll just chit chat about music. And I think, what's interesting, right, is like that thinking again at 90s what R&B was, right, and how. Oh, what's your next project? Okay, I'll take a question. What is your next project, Crystal?
I'm working on two things right now. Jesse knows that I rarely talk about BTS because everyone else does it for me. But I was asked to contribute to a BTS reader, and I've had a long running kind of grappling with the way that particularly the United States has shaped BTS for public audience. And so I'm always curious when there's a story, and this is going to like the legacy media, you know, like Time, Washington Post, when they have Forbes, Wall Street Journal, when they run a story on BTS, they almost always do the same thing, which is to completely divorce them from any kind of context, like there was no K-pop before them. And you know, kind of there's a scholar who's coined the term BTS exceptionalism. But then that's really counter to, once again, fan knowledge, really counter to the way fans experienced BTS and where they kind of, you know, how they get contextualized in terms of K-pop history. But I'm always really concerned about how the media constructs the image of BTS, because those of us who do media studies knows that the media operates in certain kinds of ways when it comes to foreign cultures, foreign masculinities, Asian masculinities. And I don't think that they're just going to stop doing that, or they've just stopped doing that for BTS. And to me, what that does is it mirrors the same thing that we saw with a group like the Beatles, right? The Beatles, you know, they start out with all of these, you know, young girls screaming, but they don't become important until white male critics come along and imbue them with all of this, you know, other stuff. And in doing so, reshape their narrative and their history so that now nobody remembers that when they first started out, they would cover Black girl group songs about Black girl groups, and nobody remembers that Billy Preston was often referred to as the fifth Beatle and why that was. And I see the same thing happening with BTS. So I'm looking at the media construction of K-pop and using BTS as a case study. And then the next project is one of my new favorite subgenres of YouTube video are what I like to call people who listen to stuff they shouldn't, other people think they shouldn't be listening to. And so it started with these two African-American twins, you know, who are very, you know, urban in their presentation. And their whole thing is like, hey, y'all, what you doing? We're going to listen to some stuff. And, you know, you expect it to be, you know, kind of critical, right? But they're like completely open to what they listen to. So the first video that I saw was them listening to Dolly Parton's Jolene. And they were like, man, this song is really great. Like, she's like getting into it. Like, that girl like trying to take her man. Like, they were like really discussing it like it was a real important kind of thing. Now, I also got to give, I'm still questioning how they are Black males in America and never heard Earth, Wind and Fire September. I'm gonna put that to the side for a second.
We got a question. That's not, no.
So then I stumbled upon all of these other videos where people, especially African Americans, like, we're gonna, you know, I'm gonna listen to the Carpenters. Let's take a look at this Nancy Sinatra, These Boots Were Made for Walking. And the thing that I love about these videos is that they're not doing it to then come around and slam this quote unquote old music. They're super open. And they listen to it as music. One guy listened to the Charlie Daniels band, The Devil Went Down to Georgia, and wondered who taught him how to rap. So it's very interesting to see them encounter this music allegedly for the first time and see how they read it. And so the next project is to look at people who aren't K-pop fans reacting to K-pop music. Because what I've seen is they do the same thing that these other people do. They're really open to it. And then they start to recognize, you know, some of the things that I talk about in the book, but they don't have the baggage that fans bring along when they watch reaction videos, because they're established fans and they have other intentions when they do that. So those are the two projects, even though I have told many people I'm not writing another book. But then again, that's what I said about this book. So maybe if I keep my mouth shut, things will work out.
Well, thank y'all so much. This has been phenomenal, and I have truly enjoyed it. I am not a K-pop fan because I decided to not be. I am a K-drama fan. So I do have a problem when like one idol is in a K-drama and all of a sudden all the K-poppers pop in and it's like, oh, I like K-drama. It's like, stay out of there, okay? You don't get to come into our room and do all that because, you know, I just have that problem. So I am ignorant in that establishment because I like to be against the grain. So I'm like, I refuse to be into K-pop, but I cannot lie. There have been a few songs that make my list and they always come, but I do decidedly try to go against BTS again because everybody's like so for it. And I'm like, listen, they have other people too. So yes. So I have been a K-drama fan for I think about 10 years. So I've been in this for a while, and this is exciting. I think I would give K-pop a chance. But thank you so much, Dr. Jessie Guestford, for having this conversation with us. Thank you, Dr. Crystal Anderson. I need to catch up with you another time so we can chat. And thank you, Dr. Berger, for letting us have this wonderful program. And I learned a lot and I'm excited.
Yes, and I echo all of that thanks on behalf of the program. Thank you both, Dr. Guestford and Dr. Anderson, for this wonderful discussion and for participating in the conversation. I've learned so much. I may even become involved in the K-pop situation myself. Very, very, very intrigued. I really appreciate you taking the time tonight, and I thank our guests for attending as well. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Y'all have a wonderful day.
You
Good night.
too.